Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here with another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be doing yet another one of our metagame analysis videos. It hasn't been too long since we did the last one there. It was around a few weeks after, maybe a couple of weeks after Brandon Despia first really entered the scene, that we decided to take a look at the metagame and see how things had shaped up. So it's been a couple of weeks since that now, so I decided to be a good time to maybe go back and see just how much has shifted as far as like what decks are being represented here in the upper tiers. The types of decks, rather, not too much has changed, although we will notice some power level discrepancies here from last time. You know, last time we took a look at this, Brandon Despia was pretty far and away the most powerful deck. Had a power level of like 20, like it was like well above 20. I think it might have even been closer to 25, while Soul Tenyi had like maybe closer to like, I don't know, 12. Well, it was above 12 because it was still tier 1, but you know, definitely Brandon Despia was taking its biggest chunk of the power level pie there. Now, as always, as ever, we do need to remember when taking a look here at MasterDuelMeta.com that this is an automatically updated tier list that uses data from community tournaments. So when looking at the actual tier list itself, if you're thinking about the ranked ladder for Master Duel Meta, then this is definitely not what you want to solely be taking into consideration, although this tier list does still tend to be, not always, but usually tends to be, a decent representation of what's going on in the ranked ladder meta as well. And then, of course, by clicking each of these individual decks here, you can access the deck breakdown, which will give you data from not just tournaments, but also ranked ladder as well as far as builds go. And then from there, if you're interested in looking at ranked ladder builds, you can go to top decks, and then look from there. I'll go ahead and show you once we go to a deck breakdown, for those who aren't familiar with Master Duel Meta there. So, yeah, Brandon Despia, like I said, definitely still the tier 1 deck to be on the lookout for as far as like the most popular deck. However, I think we're seeing a more fair and a more accurate, rather, spread of the power level here represented at this point on this current tier list, right? Like, yes, Brandon Despia is definitely the most powerful deck, but it definitely is not as overwhelmingly powerful as you might have seen when it first came out. This is something I talk a lot about, actually, when it comes to the metagame. And how decks are represented within the metagame, right? I like to often bring up a deck's power level versus popularity, because I think a lot of the time people treat a deck's power level as the sole deciding factor of how much play it is seeing, or conversely, people might then think that, oh, this deck is seeing so much play because it is so powerful, it is so absurdly powerful. Yeah, I've seen a lot of comments to the effect of like, you know, Brandon Despia is too unfair, Brandon Despia is too strong, it is OP, and needs like some kind of emergency hit. I definitely do not think that is the case personally. And this is the kind of comment you'll see with any tier 1 deck, right? Literally, it doesn't matter what the meta is. People will say that the top deck is too powerful, that needs an emergency hit, and that is unhealthy for the game. Sometimes they're right. You know, sometimes that is actually the case. I don't think that's the case with this meta at all, though. And I think, again, we're starting to see more of a balanced, well, I guess at least between the two tier 1 decks. To be fair, between Brandon Despia and Soul Tenyi, like as tier 1 as a whole, there's a difference between power. Obviously, we're seeing a difference of power level between you know, these two decks and everything else. And I do think these two decks stand a decent bit above everything else. But it's funny. I like to compare. I've compared quite a few different metas to the first meta of Master Duel, which it's so funny, and it just goes to show the cognitive bias that people have. I've seen so many people, particularly on the Master Duel subreddit lately, refer to Season 1 through 5, like that first bit of Master Duel where we had that card pool, as Drytron meta. It's like, no, it was definitely not a Drytron meta. It was a Tri-Brigade meta. Tri-Brigade was the most powerful deck. It was always at the top of Tier 1. There was like 2 seconds. There was like 2 instances for like maybe a couple of days Drytron passed Tri-Brigade, but then it would always go back to Tri-Brigade being on top. And I think people remember Drytron more than Tri-Brigade because it was the more quote-unquote oppressive deck, right? Herald of Perfection, you know, what am I thinking of? Oh, the Orange Heralds. You know, there are all these effects that would just stop you from being able to do pretty much anything, right? And yeah, like I said, a lot of people really remember that more than Tri-Brigades because Tri-Brigade was the more quote-unquote fair deck. So I honestly think we're going to kind of have something similar happen with Brandon Despia here. Not in this particular meta, but, you know, we've got sprites and I'm still not certain, actually, because I don't play the TCG/OCG, so I've only seen this name written, never spoken, but is it Tier Elementals or Terror Elementals? Like, is it Tears and Cry or Tears and Rip? I think it's Tier Elementals, like Tears and Cry, but Suffice it to say, I think when sprites and tier limitals come around, I think people will be singing quite a different tune of branded Despia. That's like, I don't know, I've seen people complain about Soul Tenyi as well. It's like, the deck's fine, like, as a tier 1 deck. I honestly think these are kind of the decks you want to see as tier 1 decks. I will say, branded Despia does get a little bit too much advantage, like, even for a tier 1 deck. Like, that is a little bit too much, I will say. But I don't think it's oppressively so. And again, at least, you know, it's not stopping you from doing anything like, I guess, you know, like a floodgate or a negate type, you know. Sure, branded Despia will pile on the advantage and disruptions, but will never, like, outright, you know, prevent you from doing anything, so. And then, yeah, as far as what's in the lower tiers, it's still the usual mix of stuff with Floowandereeze and Dragon Link sitting at the top, and everything else kind of being a bit of a hodgepodge. Speaking of Drytron, I've actually got Drytron here in the breakdown. We'll go ahead and take a look at that here shortly, but yeah, we'll go ahead and take a look at these deck breakdowns as we always do, starting from the top down. So we'll start with branded Despia, and as we look at branded Despia, actually not really much is changing here. Branded Despia is one of those builds that, like, I think took a little while to fully kind of, like, at least for me personally, I don't know, it seemed like other people were kind of pretty solid on this decision, but as far as like Adventure Engine versus Frightful Engine, and I do maintain, because I've still noticed this here, that it's closer than it looks. I think a lot of people do treat the Frightful Engine, that being of course with the Edge of Chains, the or is it the Patchworks, and of course the Polys, although Poly does tend to see it play outside of the build, because Poly is just actually generally a good card in this deck. But in any case, the Frightful Engine is definitely more favored by TCG players. I've touched on this topic before, whereas the Adventure Engine tends to be more favored by OCG players. And I do think the differences between the two are a lot closer than most people think. Like I was about to say, a lot of people, especially, you know, over here, tend to treat the Frightful Engine as like the de facto best engine. And I don't think it necessarily is. I do think it is slightly better, and I do tend to slightly prefer it as a result. However, I don't think, like I said, that is necessarily like the best engine for the deck. I think you can make a solid argument for the Adventure Engine as well, but you can see from the data here that the Adventure Engine is not represented, like, you know, whatsoever. But again, we have to remember that this is pulling data from, like, mostly the TCG side of things, right? Like, it's pulling data from you know, from tournaments and ranked ladder of players who are submitting, you know, to the site. But again, that's going to be mostly from the TCG side of things. So we need to remember that as well. It's just a good thing to remember when you're doing any amount of research in general, is like, just remember the context of which the data you're looking at, right? Because again, it might be easy to see no Adventure stuff here and think Adventure is just by far the worst engine, but it's a lot closer than it looks. And I suspect if we were to see, I really wish that there was an equivalent of Master Duel meta for the OCG side of things as well. I know there's Road to the King, but the problem with Road to the King is that, like, particularly with Master Duel coverage, that they put out the meta coverages so infrequently. It's usually a decent amount of time after that meta is relevant. So that's kind of why I tend not to look at there as much, but that will show you a side of the Master Duel meta that you're not necessarily seeing. So maybe in future Master Duel meta analysis videos, I should make more of an effort to include this. I'll have to actually note that, see if maybe it's worthwhile to include that in my research there. But in any case, as far as like the build itself goes, you know, we're seeing pretty much like more or less the same thing here. We're actually seeing an increase in the play of Albion the Shrouded Dragon, which is a card I have considered adding to branded decks. And then Branded Lost, I will admit, is a card I have been kind of leaning more towards including. I talked about this before, how Branded Lost is one of those cards that really is just constantly borderline. It's constantly like fluctuating on the brink of like, do I want to include this card? Do I want to? Do I not want to? I talked about before about how when deck building, I like to often build above 40 cards and then trim down to 40. Branded Lost, like I mentioned before, just usually ends up being, not even usually, just always at this point, ends up being one of those cards I trim out when I'm getting the deck down to 40. But that said, you know, with my current build, I'm kind of playing like Mercurier without a way to really do much with it besides, you know, with Branded Lost. I think a comment actually pointed this out, and I realized, like, oh yeah, the Mercurier isn't really doing too much here. Actually, I'm looking at percentages here. We are seeing a pretty dramatic increase of play of the Dramaturge of Despia. So maybe I'll have to try subbing out the Mercurier for the Dramaturge. I can definitely see how having a, you know, the Dramaturge anytime I play against it is really annoying. A 3k beater that can just negate all of your extract monsters. Well, not all of, but, you know, the extract monsters that come out. So yeah, I might have to give that change a try there. Otherwise, I'm looking at the percentages, and I'm not really seeing anything too different here from like the last time we looked. So I think we're good. I think we can move on from Braided Despia. Soul Tenyi. I think this is also a more or less solved deck. This deck has been solved for, honestly, pretty much since it came out. Like I'm looking here, there's not really too much that's going on here. Although, wow, I'm looking at the Shythana, seeing playing 89% of builds. I guess that makes sense now that the Hulk line is gone. You know, before when Hulky Fibrax was legal, we were seeing Shythana play like more like 25% of decks. But yeah, and then the Heavenly Dragon Circle. Yeah, that's seeing a lot more play as well. In fact, actually, there is one thing I'm noticing here is that Vessel of the Dragon Cycle is more or less completely gone, which again makes sense to me. I do think Vessel was a little bit better when Hulky Fibrax was legal, because that card could, with a Tenyi monster, set up a Hulk line. It could often set up a Hulk line plus an additional play on top of that. Yeah, no, it doesn't look like the loss of the Hulky Fibrax engine is holding Soul Tenyi back too much. At all. Again, looks like they're leaning more into Heavenly Dragon Circle and Shythana, which, you know, that change I actually had thought about making for a while, but it was really you all in the comments who kind of like pushed me more towards that suggestion. So, as always as ever, I want to definitely give you all a hearty thanks for that suggestion there. I think the build, or the video was even called like, you know, building our Soul Tenyi together, or like, what was it, updating our Soul Tenyi deck with your suggestions. It was something to that effect, so... because that was a great suggestion that came from you all in the comments, and it was multiple people from what I remember. So, yeah, that's always why I like to kind of get that feedback there. Looks like Desires is actually seeing a significant amount of play here in Soul Tenyi. Actually, it's seeing play in pretty much every single build now that I'm looking at it. Was that right? Yeah, it looks like 100% of decks right now are playing Desires. It's just a matter of if you play 2 or 3. I'm actually currently not playing Desires, and I really probably should at this point. This is another thing the comments have pointed out before, that like, and I'm looking at the, you know, the deck breakdown here now. Like, Soul Tenyi plays like 3 of pretty much all of its cards, like multiples of pretty much all of its cards, save for like maybe Blackout and like Shythana, which are not big deals if they get banished at all. So yeah, I think I'm gonna have to update my build here to maybe try Desires once again. And of course, you know, this deck being as consistent as it is and as resilient to disruption as it can be, Desires is definitely one of those cards that will aid in both those things, very much so. So the extra deck, I am noticing that we're starting to see Geomathematic Final Sigma see more play in the extra deck here. Definitely a good secret, and some of you in the comments mentioned this as well. When I was talking about, you know, more extra deck cards to replace, of course, the Hulk and Auroradon that went out. And the 3 monks here as well. I really do like 3 monk of the Tenyi. I will admit, it's not often at all that the 3rd monk comes up, but just having that extra resource, I think, in the graveyard, or in the extra deck rather, to set up a non-effect monster, because that's so many times, but there have been enough times playing Soul Tenyi with 2 monk, while Hulk and Auroradon were legal, where like I had a really grindy game where it came down to needing another monk on board and not being able to get one out. So yeah, I definitely like having 3 monk of the Tenyi here in the extra deck. Plus, like, let's be real, there's not really a whole lot else that's going to be going into this extra deck. Actually, just looking at this like breakdown in general, this deck looks pretty much mostly solved. So yeah, I'm going to be definitely refining the Soul Tenyi build based on what is being represented here. Alright, Floowandereeze, once again, not really seeing too much different here, except we are seeing Floowandereeze in the Advent of Adventure. This is a recent addition from the latest Cosmic Ocean special pack, and it is one that a lot of players are not super happy about, and it's understandable. You know, this card definitely makes the deck even more annoying, read consistent. Basically replaces Book of Moon. The idea is that, you know, this card, if your, you know, Floowandereeze monster is about to get negated, you can use Floowandereeze in the Advent of Adventure, and then from there, you can dodge the negation, get your effect off, and then, you know, Book of Moon will allow you to do that, and that's why it's all play anyway. But now, Floowandereeze in the Advent of Adventure can do the exact same thing, and then you also get to add a Floowandereeze monster or field spell from your deck to your hand. So it's even more disgusting on top of that. So definitely for the Floowandereeze players, a welcome addition to the build. I think for the rest of us, might be a bit disdainful that they get yet another tool. Although I don't think it's going to crank up the power level of the deck significantly. I think we did see a little bit more Floowandereeze decks on the ladder as a result when this card came out, but I don't think that this will like hugely shift Floowandereeze up in the meta as far as like power level goes. I think Floowandereeze is still a pretty solid tier 2 deck. I think that if you are looking to craft a deck that doesn't require too many ultra rare specifics, although it does require this card now, as an in-archetype ultra rare specific, but it's pretty much that plus Dimension Shifter. Otherwise, all the other ultra rares are staples, like, you know, Ash. You don't even need the Maxis here, honestly. So, yeah, if you're looking for a easy to play and relatively cheap deck to ladder with, Floowandereeze is still going to be the deck for you. That said, it does tend to have a bit of a reputation. So, but, you know, some people will enjoy playing a deck for that reason, and whatever, you know, that's valid. I don't really begrudge anyone who chooses to play decks like Floowandereeze or Eldritch. You know, like I said, it's legal, it's valid, you know, enjoy the game however you would like to. Yeah, that said, I don't personally have much to say about Floowandereeze. I don't really play them too often or hardly at all myself. And yeah, again, aside from the advent of Adventure, not too much. Replacing Book of Moon, not really. Pretty much anything has changed with the build here so far, with the deck in general. So, all right, Dragon Link. I'm noticing an interesting trend here in Dragon Link where we're seeing kind of a downturn of certain cards like Valor and Imperm, right? I don't know. Sometimes these like downward trend kind of things don't really mean too much. It kind of tends to more mean like the number of copies that are being played. It looks like that's actually the case here. So I wonder if people are just cutting Valors and Imperms in general, not out entirely, but just in general. Chaos Dragon Leveneer, I've noticed seeing a downturn in play. I've not really played this much myself in Dragon Link, mostly because it's like another ultra to craft, and it's one that I don't really consider like essential for the deck. I think this is better, I think, if you're playing more of like a 60 card variant, which it does look like is becoming a little bit more popular as we're seeing a rise in play of the grass that looks greener. And actually, let me actually go down to the top decks here. I just want to see like how many of these are in fact 60 cards. Looks like a fair number of them if you're seeing the totals here. This is what I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the video, how you can go down to top decks and see the latest builds. Yeah, it looks like 60 card builds are becoming a little bit more popular here, which would definitely make sense that the grass is greener, seeing more play. Black Metal Dragon. So this is interesting. I feel like this card is kind of constantly in flux in this deck of how often it sees play. Like, I really feel like the last time I looked at this, it was seeing play as a 3 of in most decks, but I guess I could be wrong about that. I mean, that's kind of how I built my Dragon Link deck, and I tend to build mostly, not entirely, but mostly based on the deck breakdown, the data that's providing. So, I don't know. I've seen a lot of people suggest Starlight Sephirate over the Black Metal Dragon. I definitely would very much like to try this card over Black Metal Dragon next time I come back around to Dragon Link, because this card seems pretty awesome. The Wyverburster and Collapse Serpent, I think, are a lot more essential to the deck's plays than I've previously given credit for. In the past, I've kind of treated them as just like, you know, nice extenders and not much beyond that. But you know, having played the deck a little bit more, not too much more, but a little bit more myself, I'm definitely seeing like how these cards are super duper important to the deck, and how they are kind of like core to making them function. So, you know, having the ability to start our plays by searching them out definitely would make comboing in general a lot easier with the deck. You know, the Black Metal Dragon into the Red Med also does set up some plays, but I think not quite as many as the Wyverburster Collapse Serpent. I'm also seeing the Absorautor Dragon is seeing more plays that do have. Like, we're not seeing too much differences in like what is being played here with Dragon Link. I think just more of the ratios. So, yeah, no, this is definitely a deck that, I mean, I feel like this is one of those decks that's kind of constantly in flux just due to the nature of how it's built and how it can be built, right? Like, you can play the 60 card Grass variant, you can play the trimmed down, slightly above 40 card variant. I might actually try to get it down to 40 cards just to see if I can. I've played against 40 card Dragon Link decks, and I always am kind of wondering, like, how? Like, what did you do? Like, how are you able to get down to 40 cards? Like, what did you cut? I guess I could look at the opponent's deck after the game and confirm that, but in any case there. Dragon Link, I think, as a whole, isn't changing too much as far as how it's playing. Just kind of like, again, what engines see play. I think because this deck is so variable in that regard, it tends to fluctuate a little bit more variably. So, all right, I want to take a look at Drytron here because we are seeing a significant upturn in this deck seeing play once again here. And looks like we are introducing like an Albaz engine, a branded engine, which makes sense. I just noticed this Vanity's Ruler. Huh, that's interesting. I guess being a light fairy is why you would want this over like Vanity's Fiend. Interesting. It's playing 80% of Drytron decks. Okay, so it looks like about 80% are, you know, using these newer builds here. Although I was gonna say, yeah, there probably isn't too much data that it's pulling from here as far as that goes. Although there's a decent amount from the last little under a month or so. I'm just looking at October in particular. Of course, all these other lists are still relevant as far as, like, you know, they're legal for the time being, but I kind of like to prefer to pull data from only the last, like, couple of weeks if possible. Sometimes the deck isn't represented enough that you can really afford to do that. Like I said, if we did that for Drytron here, we'd only be pulling data for like 3 different decks, which we should be looking at least, you know, at least a little bit more than that in order to really ascertain what's going on with the deck in the meta here. So it's interesting too that, like, significantly over 40 cards seems to be the case for Drytron. A lot of 55s here, which is interesting to me. Although that could also be, no, I was gonna say it could also be the same deck, like the same player, but no, these are all no repeats here except for down here on the 22nd. But yeah, interesting. Okay, so it's funny too because I've actually come across Drytron a little bit more often. I've noticed that on ladder than I have in the past here. So it's funny too. I was just talking about Drytron earlier in the Season 1 meta as well. So you know, this is, to be fair, one of those decks that I think kind of like Adamantipator was before Hulk got banned, and kind of like I think Adventure Phantomite is a little bit now. It's one of those decks where, like, after it got hit, people just kind of dropped it all together, where it's like, I did think the deck was still pretty decent. Like, I think if it saw, again, we're talking about power level versus representation, dictating where a deck is placed in the meta. I think if Drytron had seen proper representation, it could have easily been a tier 3 deck for at least some amount of the time since it got hit, since, like, Soul Tenyi came out. But it's still a solid rogue deck all the same. But I think it could have been more like upper rogue, and again, maybe even potentially bleeding into tier 3 a little bit. Again, if it had seen a little bit more play there. But yeah, I still have not played Drytron myself, like, since Master Duel started. I was just way too enthralled with Tri Brigade and other decks when it was actually, like, you know, more meta relevant. But so I don't have too much to personally comment of how the deck plays now versus then, because again, I just haven't played it at all. But interesting to see this deck come back after such a significant amount of time. The branded engine does seem to really kind of revitalize quite a few different decks, or add that extra power to quite a few of decks, like Tri Brigade, for example. One last breakdown I want to take a look at was Salamangreats. You know, we took a look at this last time when it seemed like Salamangreat was, like, kind of saying, like, an overinflation, like overinflated representation. Like, it was tier 2 last time we took a look at it, and it's like, or at least according to the tier list here on Master Duel meta. And you know, I made a comment of like, well, I don't think it's tier 2, but I think it's definitely a solid rogue, maybe even tier 3. Now that the structure deck has come out, and now that I have had a chance to play with Salamangreats for quite a bit now, not quite a bit, but for at least a little bit, I'll just try the deck myself for really the first time. I will say I do think this is a solid tier 3 deck in terms of power level, and definitely in terms of representation. Well, honestly, in terms of power level, it might be closer to, like, you know, hovering between tier 3 and rogue, but I don't think it's unfair at all to say that this deck is tier 3, especially right now with the way it's being represented in the meta, right? Of course, the structure that came out, so if you're playing on even regular ranked ladder, not just like the Link Festival ladder, but even regular ladder, you're probably seeing Salamangreats just about everywhere, probably once every, like, 4 or 5 games or so. And again, that is just because of the structure deck. Like, of course, all these cards were legal before. Well, actually, we do have Decode Talker, Heat Soul, which to Salamangreats itself is not like a huge boost, but it's definitely still a welcome addition to the deck, as well as to, like, adding Nister and other cyberspace decks as well. This card is actually insanely good, and I definitely can't wait to get back to adding Nister to try Heat Soul in the build there as well. But yeah, Salamangreats, I think this deck is not only a lot of fun, but I think its power level it's definitely higher than I thought it was before I tried it out. And I think that's going to be the case that a lot of people are going to realize as well. So this might be one of those decks that kind of sticks around even after the popularity trend tends to die down a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see Salamangreat represented in tier 3, even like the next metagame analysis moving forward. Yeah, it'll honestly kind of take, like, I think a huge shakeup in terms of either a ban list or a significant new selection pack being released for not only that to really change, but honestly a lot of the changes that we're seeing here, or for anything that we're seeing currently here to change. You know, I think the meta we're in right now is pretty solidly, and I think it was also the case when pretty much branded Despia first came out, right? The meta is more or less solved. Like, we know that branded Despia is the best deck. We know Soul Tenyi isn't far behind. And everything else is more or less teching or playing around to kind of compensate for that. That said, I don't think those two decks are particularly oppressive in this current meta. These two decks, branded Despia and Soul Tenyi. I think if you're going to have tier 1 decks, like, kind of dominating. These are the kind of tier 1 decks you want to see, right? Again, because they're not putting out like too many like Floodgates or Omni Negates. Like, yeah, Soul Tenyi's got like Chi Shao plus Baron and, you know, plus Protos, but like, yeah, there are definitely decks that do much scarier things than that, and there have been decks that have been good, that have done much scarier things than that. So I think if that's the worst we have to deal with, I think we're in a fine meta. Now, again, we're going to see how that changes once Sprites and Tier Elementals come out, but I think people might be singing a different tune about this metagame and Branded Despia in general once that's the case, but we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. In any case, I think that's about all the time I've got for this video, so thank you very much for watching all the way to the very end. I definitely greatly appreciate that. Also appreciate those of you who are commenting and subscribing. Comments, definitely let me know what you think of the meta right now. If there's any decks that you think are being like underrepresented, any decks that you think are like kind of sleeper hits, or just in general, any thoughts about the meta, I would definitely love to hear from you in the comments there, as I always do. And yeah, I think that's about all the time that I have for this video. So without further ado, this is Hexlex signing out, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day.